Well, I'm here again with my teacher, Tressa Boulden. Anyway, I'm here again
Yeah.
with Tressa, and today I wanted to just capture her story. I wanted to hear um, how she learned, who she learned from, what makes Tressa Tressa. So, Tressa, when did you start writing?
Um, the pursuit of learning to ride, I probably didn't start until I was 5, but my infinity with horses started when I was much younger with the Safeway horse. The little mechanical horse. I think is when I really started noticing that, those animals are interesting, and I think I want to ride one. And there are pictures of my dad putting me on ponies and stuff when I was pretty little. Like I think the only picture I have that's really little is I was like 16 months old, and then I have another one of me when I'm like, you know, 5, 6 years old riding. Um, so yeah, I started my passion and my interest in horses pretty early, but I didn't really get to have riding lessons till between 6 and 7 through a private school I went to called Children's Workshop, and it was in Petaluma. And one of the moms ran like a 4-H club for the kids, and she taught riding lessons in the hills of Petaluma, California. And back then there were a lot of Shetland ponies, a lot of little Welsh mountain ponies, and then thoroughbreds, and that's what we rode as little kids. And so that's where my career, or not my career, but my passion for horses and interest in riding started.
And were your parents horse people?
No, they were not. My mom was a teacher, and later became Head Start teacher and home visitor, and then ended up running Head Start in this part of California. And then my dad, he was a Vietnam vet, and he had uh, had a motorcycle shop at that time. But as my mom and dad split pretty early in my life, my mom remarried to my stepdad, who's really been the main father in my life. And he's also a teacher and a counselor, a guidance counselor for, students. So I had 2 teachers essentially raising me,
Yeah.
but not, you know, they weren't animal people. My real father had a thing for horses. He used to go up to his family ranch as a young boy and ride the horses on that ranch. They had a cattle ranch in Geyserville, which is above where I live. And so he always enjoyed being on the ranch and all the things that came with that. So he kind of, he bought my first pony from an auction, who ended up being a total little monster. So my first real experiences in riding, I think I was probably 4, maybe. And I remember him putting me on the horse and then thinking it was so easy to ride, and saying grab the reins and the pony would take off and scrape me off on a tree and I'd fall off and be like, oh, it's terrible. It was an awesome way to start riding, because
Uh-huh.
it developed some fear in me when I actually started riding lessons. I was like, these things, I can't control these things. They take off. But, so I had to work through that as a little kid.
So
So,
you kept riding even though you were scared, and you started taking formal riding lessons at 5, you said?
yeah, yeah. I mean, we'd ride bareback, and no, it was like between 6 and 7, probably. I started taking actual riding lessons. And, so part of that was we had to be able to do all aspects of what it took to ride. If you couldn't catch your pony that day, that was going to be your lesson. So we had to learn how to catch Shetland ponies in a herd of Shetland ponies. And that's a pretty big ask of a little kid, but we did it. And then we'd have to lead them up to the barn and do all the grooming, including picking up the feet. And I mean, if you were little around horses, you know how hard it is to hold up a horse's foot.
Mhm.
Whether it be a pony or a full-size horse, it's like a monumental job. So that was a big deal. And then we didn't really have an arena. We had the top of the hill of flat spots. We'd ride up this mountain and go to the top of the hill, and we'd have our lessons going around learning emergency dismounts and poles and jumping and stuff. And then, or we'd take a trail ride through that area of town and go to like a park, because back then you could ride through the parks and do whatever. It wasn't as big of a deal as it is now, and there wasn't as much liability in concern. So yeah, it was really a good experience as a child. And then of course I never lost my passion for that. My parents kind of went, oh, this is, going to burn off, but it never did. And then on my dad's side of the family, as I said, there were ranchers, but there was, on his mom's side, there were people who were in the racing business for a couple of generations. And so my dad's cousin would occasionally send me bridles that were worn out from the racetrack. Or if I was down visiting, I got to go with my dad's aunt, my Aunt Gus, who was helping her son, Bobby, who was a trainer on the racetrack. I got to go to the racetrack and help with the thoroughbreds. And maybe I got to, hold one while it was getting bathed while some adult was supervising, or clean out a stall. And I thought that was just the best thing ever. So I never lost that passion. And then by the age of 10, we would look through the newspaper ads and go, oh, look at that pony. It's only, $50 or $100, or, they weren't that expensive back then. So I'd be like, oh, that one's in the area. And I'd call all the ads. So this little kid's calling ads to get a horse. And, at the time my parents had split, my mom was single, and we were living in a trailer park. So yeah, where am I going to keep a horse? But as she met my stepdad, I was probably about 10. And I had actually talked this lady into letting me come see the pony, and talked my mom into taking me out there. And so every weekend I'd go visit this pony. And this woman, I think, just finally was like, just take the frickin' thing. Just take it. It's yours. So I had made friends with a neighbor who had a couple of horses. And she let me keep the pony on her property. And I'd go over there and help her clean the stalls or feed or whatever. But I also got a job cleaning harness. So I was cleaning like the harness for the horses that they drove in carriage in San Francisco. There's a gentleman who ran that business, and this woman worked for him part-time to earn money for her horses. So she gave me a job cleaning harness, doing that. And then other than that, I had at that point located to Sebastopol, where, we have rolling apple orchard hills, and there were, vast ranches to ride through. So I rode all over the hills, and it wasn't until I was about, I think probably 12 or 13, I got my first actual horse, and it was a thoroughbred off the racetrack. And, my parents didn't know what they were doing. Neither did my grandparents. And my cousin Bobby's like, oh yeah, just let it down for, for a couple months, and then she can start playing with it. Well, this was a 4-year-old thoroughbred. So I went from a pony that I had finagled off of a woman, to a thoroughbred off the racetrack that had been early retired because he had fractured a sesamoid. It had been healed, and then they weren't going to put him back to racing. But he had been a winner, so he knew how to run. Mm-hmm. So I have pictures of me, I'm in my early teens, and I'm going through the apple orchards, and I'm in a Western saddle, and I'm in a full 2-point, and I am in a full gallop. And my girlfriend and I, because back then you just had a regular camera, we tried to take cool pictures of each other doing this. And
you were 13?
I was like 13, 14, 15 through that time. And my girlfriend, Tanya, who also rode in that riding program, her and I, we would set up jumps around my parents' house, which they only had an acre. So we'd run through their driveway, go between the house and the garage, jump up a hill, go around a tree, and we'd have like 4 different jumps, and we'd jump the hedge. And, we're just kids, but we were very creative about how we got things done. So yeah, that was my early on experiences. And then that developed into my parents had bought a place. My mom and my stepdad bought a place in Sebastopol that had, an acre. My grandfather built a stall for this thoroughbred I had. So he's kind of living alone there, which, you know, in hindsight isn't a very happy life. But across the street, there was a 40-acre ranch. And I befriended the woman, the owner of that, who was she's part of a generational family in Sebastopol, and they owned the Chevy dealership, her family, but she was a horsewoman. And I said, I'd be happy to come over and clean your stalls if I could use your arena and maybe get a riding lesson or so. So I ended up learning from her and getting to go over there and help with her horses also. So I became somebody she trusted to feed and look after those horses. And then that developed into I worked for another Western trainer who bred paint horses, and I would clean 30 stalls and paddocks all throughout high school. I did this. And I'd run her summer camps teaching kids. There'd be like 20 kids in a class. I started colts for her. I ran the feed store. They had a feed store and a tack store. So I learned how to do that. And when they would leave, I would stay at their place. So I got a lot of experience there. I also worked for a woman who became the president of the Morgan Association, who was in our area. I worked for her in the latter part of my high school years. And some of this is layered on top of each other because I did both. And I had a couple of jobs doing miscellaneous horses. And I also had a friend who their family had a huge Arabian farm. So I would ranch sit for them. And when they'd leave, I'd take care of the babies or tend to their wounds or whatever needed to happen and just house sit. And they had, hundreds of horses there. So they had a staff, but I was assigned to do certain things to maybe help them out. And I later got a job with a guy who was the top cutting horse trainer in the area. And he did literally 30 head of horses a day. And he was not a nice guy to work for, but I did learn what I didn't want to do ever. And I learned about, going through a lot of horses and being efficient, because he wouldn't even let me walk around to the correct side to put the saddle on. He'd tell me it was a waste of time. So I had to put the saddles on with my right arm from the off side. And like I wasn't allowed anything I did. It was always about efficiency. If I went up the hill and I hadn't grabbed another horse and ponied it up, I was wasting time, So I learned a lot about that. And I rode, some babies, like 2-year-olds. And, he
What
do stuff
age are you
like,
at this point?
sorry.
How old are you at this point?
At this point, I'm like 16, 17 probably. And, he would do things like, oh yeah, you're going to ride babies. See those rowel spurs? Put me those big Mexican rowel spurs on. He'd go, keep your toes in. That was his method of teaching.
Okay.
Or when he was like, oh, you want to learn how to sit better on, because he'd have me ride turn back, or he'd let me sometimes cut one cow or whatever. And he'd be like, you need to sit better, I'll show you. And he'd have me tie the reins up and hold the horn and put me in the round pen and jump in front of me with the whip. And I was so freaking mad. I was so mad they did, because it hurt, it was painful, that I was like, you can't do that. You do it. You do it. Let me do this to you. And he got on laughing. He's like, oh, okay. So I did it to him, and he was like, whatever, woo, But he had some pretty famous stock, So I got the privilege of sitting on some top cutting horses and riding babies and stuff. And then I left to Denmark shortly after high school, because I had met young man or young boy, whatever, teenager, that was from Denmark, and kind of fell in love with him. And he had to go back after a year. His uncle lived here, but he had to go back, and it felt like my heart got pulled out of my chest. So I figured out a way to follow him, and I sold my truck, and
when you want something, you make it happen, don't you?
Yeah, and I sold I had a little 2-year-old paint colt. I sold him. Well, I actually left him with a friend, and then he got sold later. And then I had sold my thoroughbred, to get that paint colt. So I had some money reserves. And it was funny because my stepdad was trying to get me to go to the junior college here, and because he's a college guy. And I was like, but I want to do horses, like maybe there's something there I could help with that pursuit, but I wanted to go to England and go to the British Horse Society and learn, get a BHSHI, degree so that I could have some credentials to work off of. And I found out how much it would cost. And he said, well, I'll meet you 2-1. This was the agreement in the last year of my high school. And he didn't say like you have to work at a grocery store or something. He just said, I'll meet you 2-1. He didn't say how specifically I need to come up with that money. So I was like, great. Sold my truck, sold everything, and said, oh, well, here's the thing. I'm weighing this. I'm either going to go follow my boyfriend or I'm going to go to England. So I have this much money and you said you'd meet me 2-1. And he goes, well, you didn't work for that. So I went, okay, I guess I'm going to Denmark. And I did. I went to Denmark. My parents were gone camping. They came back, and I had told my mom, I'm 18 now. Give me my birth certificate. I turned 18 over the summer and got my passport, and never had really taken a bus across town, and put myself on a plane to New York, and then from New York to Copenhagen, and went to Denmark. So, and in Denmark, I ended up working in a couple of barns there. One of them was a barn in Swanborg, or near Swanborg, but on the island of Foon, that had the only producing Frisian stallion. So that was like the first time I ever saw Frisians in person and got to handle them, and went, oh, they're kind of cool looking horses. But no one, I think there was one girl who had them here, but they weren't really, no one really had Frisians here at that time. So I worked there, and they had Danish warm bloods, and so, but they didn't know and before I had left, I had been working. So I kind of skipped some parts. I had worked as a young teenager. I had worked in Gwen Stockerbrand's barn. I was a working student. So I got introduced to Gwen early on. I think I was about 13 at that point, because I'd seen a commercial with her riding through the wine country and doing dressage. And I went, oh, wow, I really want to learn that, because it looked cool. And, dressage wasn't really around here very much. It was a new phenomenon back in the 80s. It wasn't as prevalent as it is now, And so I figured out where she was in our area, and asked if I could come be a working student. Well, so, I picked up rocks out of the arena. I wrapped polo wraps. You did menial stuff to get to sit on a horse. So I had introduced myself to Gwen at that point. And then I had started working for a student of hers in the area who had a sales barn, and I was riding thoroughbreds off the racetrack for her. And I had just started to do that, and then I decided I was going to Denmark. So I left that. And so when I went to Denmark and I'm working in those barns, I'm doing things like cleaning stalls, grooming horses, nothing that's below anybody, but it was slightly disappointing because I wanted more riding time, and people were willing to hand me the horses they wanted me to exercise or something, but they were like little ponies. So it wasn't as, there wasn't the opportunity that I had here. And I started to get homesick, after a half year there. I was getting homesick, and I thought, I'm not going to become a rider here. I'd also applied for the Danish riding school, but hadn't heard from them. I married my sweetheart, and so I was able to apply for the Danish riding school. Well, it wasn't until maybe 3 years later, when I was already back in the States, that they accepted me into their program.
Oh, really?
And I went, yeah, I'm not going back to go to the program. So then when I came back from Denmark, so I had a job instantly, at this one barn working with the thoroughbreds. And then I also went and got a job in a grocery store to provide some, consistent money, because you know how that is. So yeah, from there, I I started riding with a couple other people, and one woman ended up giving me, I told her I wanted to teach. So she ended up giving me some of her traveling students that were, you know, that maybe she didn't want to work with or she didn't have time for. And so I started to develop a little business on the side of working at this one barn and also at a grocery store, of going to people's places and giving them riding lessons.
But are you teaching dressage at this point or
Yeah,
just you're okay?
yes, I am. I am, you know, at a foundational level, not what I know now. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? I was teaching
Yeah.
what I knew. And it was all based on the things I'd been learning from these other people, you know. Um, and you know, through that I met a lot of people, and I started to develop a business and whatnot. And um, there was a point where it kind of pivoted, and I went, oh, I think I have enough business that I can actually drop the grocery store, because I hated it. You know, I was, you know, I put everything I've got into any job I have. I'm not you know, I'm always do my best, but it wasn't going to be my lifelong job, even though
Mhm.
I did get my ex's teeth fixed. And, you know, we had good benefits and stuff. So it was worth it in that time period to have it. Um, but yeah, so I mean, there's just so much that happened in that time. And then I started getting to maybe ride with some clinicians and stuff. I rode with a guy named Klaus Bergener, who was a general in the German army that people had been bringing over for clinics. He was very nice. He taught concepts like the horse can stretch to the bit, you know, things like that. And maybe not in refinement, but the ideas were there. You know, I had opportunities to ride with a lot of different clinicians with big names, because I started riding other people's horses, and maybe they'd take me to a clinic or pay for a clinic, or I saved up enough money that I was able to do that myself. And then probably by the time I was 21, I started having like my own set of training horses. You know, maybe it was only 3 or 4. And then it turned out by the time I was in my mid 20s, you know, before I met Melissa, I had a barn of 25 horses, and I was working 7 days a week. I'd get up and I'd be at the barn at 6, and I wouldn't leave the barn till probably after 10, you know. And at the time, you know, we didn't have any money. I had 2 pennies to scratch together, but I was working a lot and I loved it. And, you know, cleaning all those stalls, I'd get working students. Sometimes I'd run newspaper ads and be able to get a couple working students. Nowadays, that's almost an impossibility, as you know. Um, so yeah, so that's kind of where my real business started, when I started being accumulating clients and having a bigger and bigger barn. And it got to the point where I rented the stalls, because I wasn't happy with the care that was being provided. And I thought, well, I can buy my own hay, I can do all of this, and they'll just rent the stall. So I did that. And and then it wasn't until 2003 or 2 that I bought my own place with yet another ex.
So at what point did you stumble upon Melissa? And this is for people
I
listening. This is Melissa Sims. You can
Okay,
use Melissa Sims.
exactly. So one of the clients I acquired, a fairly wealthy woman that was out in Glen Ellen, I would travel to her and work with her and her warm bloods. And she would occasionally throw clinics. I rode with Hans von Blix and Finicky at her place. And then she was talking about this woman, Melissa, and showed me a video that wasn't very good. I couldn't barely see it, but it kind of to me looked like, I'm like, this looks like a ballet. You know, I wasn't familiar really with this idea of riding dressage. I was really only familiar with the sport version that I had been introduced to. And so I kind of went, okay, yeah, I'll ride in the clinic. So I brought myself I had a Polish Arab that I talked about that I had acquired from this one friend with the Arabian farm. That was quite difficult. And then I brought a couple thoroughbreds, because I still had quite a lot of thoroughbreds that I was riding, and their owners. And rode with Melissa. And the first time I met her, I really was like, you know, who is this woman? Like, she's telling me all these things that are opposite to what I had learned. And, you know, at the time I was riding with Klaus Bergener. I'd ridden with Gerhard Politz, Lilo Four, a number of big names in the industry that, they were good teachers and had different aspects to what they were teaching that were helpful at the time.
What
And
can
here's
she tell you that were so surprising to you?
Well, because my Polish Arab he was tricky. He was very particular and made a normal hot horse look like nothing. He was you could think you're doing all the right things, and he'd throw his tongue over the bit and leap through the air and almost break your nose with his top of his head. At one point he had gone up and over on me and fell on my leg. So I had a lot of respect for how quick and agile he was, and every time I got on him, I was like, you know had to be courageous. So what she told me was essentially that my seat wasn't good enough. And I thought it was, because everybody else was telling me what a nice rider I was. um, and then she was telling me things like, well, we're going to loosen this noseband a lot and drop the bit down. Well, horse that puts its tongue over the bit, you're kind of hesitant to let them do that, right? So everybody else had been like, oh, take the bit up in his mouth until he's smiling, and then he can't get his tongue over it or whatever. I had more than one trainer professional tell me to do that. Um, and then she was telling me to get into a half seat, a lighter seat, so that I could stay with the motion of the horse. And these were things that, funny enough, that I had instinctually done because I'd ridden so many thoroughbreds that I had a feeling for riding hot horses. And I always been like, yeah, I need to sit forward, but I had been corrected to sit up and be straight and ride a certain way, and not taking into account the feel of the horse and the physics that goes into that at the time. That wasn't what I was being taught. It was a look that I was being taught, and it didn't work for this horse, or other horses. Um, so things like that. So I'm like, okay, she wants me to lean forward. She wants me to lower my hands, and she wants me to loosen the noseband. And, she wanted me to teach him to stretch. She's trying to show me how to teach him to stretch. And I just thought this is the weirdest thing ever, because it was, you know, my hands right and left of the neck, as opposed to having my hands close together at that point. It wasn't because this is where you stay. It was because this is where we needed to start with this particular horse in this particular moment.
Mm-hmm.
And that's all a clinician can deal with, is the moment. And Melissa was somebody that she might not have been received as a great clinician, because she was actually going to tell you the truth about what needed to happen and try to just teach you one piece of that. And if you weren't a patient person, and you weren't somebody who was going to come back for more and more and more, and accumulate the information to make a picture, you're not going to learn very well from her, because you have to be somebody who can extrapolate, right? So my first instincts were like, okay, this is weird, but my horse did go better, but I don't know if I like her. And I was like, because she wasn't sugarcoating it for me. She was just like, well, you have a choice. You can learn something that's really going to help you, or you can do what everybody else is doing, kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, well, you know, so jokingly said to one of my friends and students, I'm like, she's like an evil ballerina. She's very pretty and her hair was pinned back. And I was just like, she's just an evil ballerina. And I didn't want to rhyme with her. And it wasn't really until like a half year later that I figured out who I had kind of foo-fooed. And I went in, and I was reading a dressage and CT magazine, and I see these pictures of her on the stallion Serafino, one of which is back here, a part of the phase where she's stretching forward, outward, and then it goes and evolves into the Piaffe. And Ulrich Schnitzer from the von Neindorf Institute took those pictures. And it was a student of hers had written an article about when in a horse show do you see these things? When do you see a horse going like this? And then it talks about, what's actually happening to the horse's top line, and how opening the back, and how we need to think of the horse being in alignment and then laterally flexible, not just pulling its neck right and left, and why. And so I was like, oh, wow, I'd really like to ride like that person. And then I'm like, wait, I met that person already. I met that woman. And so I went on a pursuit to find her again, and found out that she lived in Katati. And there was always the joke that when I first met her, she was like, well, why would I want to teach you again? Because, she thought like I just kind of blew her off. And so I had to convince her. I had to say, like, look, I realized I made a mistake. I had to admit that. And I realized I'm missing an opportunity. And I really want to learn this correctly. And I throw in the towel and I'll do whatever it takes, kind of thing. And she goes, well, I'll think about it. And the funny part is I didn't know where she lived. I just had kind of an idea, an inkling. So I had a couple people who maybe knew her. Oh, it was one woman who was a working student of hers that I met. And she's like, oh yeah, her place is around here, but I didn't know an address. So I had called and called, and her husband, who answered the phone, said, oh, she's in Germany. Yeah, she'll probably be back between this time and this time, but I don't know. I'll have her call you when she gets back. And I never heard from her. So I decided one day I'm going to go look because I'm frustrated now. And I literally found her place, and I ended up pulling into her driveway the exact moment she pulled into her driveway from the airport from Germany. So when I had presented her with like, hey, I throw in the towel, I want to surrender to this classical riding. And she went, let me think about it. I didn't really like that answer. So I got down on my hands and knees and told her I was going to kiss her feet. And she's like, what are you doing? And then she started laughing. And I go, okay, are you going to? She's like, okay, come here at 10 in the morning with your horse and I'll teach you. And I'm like, okay, great. So I kind of like, I strong armed her into teaching me by being crazy. And so when I got there, I didn't know she had all her students visiting from Texas and Oklahoma and everything waiting for her there because she had a guest cottage and they were all staying there and they were coming to have lessons. So she had them all lined up on the fence, sitting on the edge of the fence to watch me have a riding lesson. Because she's like, oh, this is going to be good. You should all watch. And the way it was described to me by a girl that was there, a student, later, is she said, yeah, we were all waiting for you to just be this complete defiant student and not listen to her or think, she was weird. And in fact, you ended up being really able to do everything she said, and that you were a good writer, in fact. And then later her husband came up to me, who was in the San Francisco Symphony. He was a cellist. And he said, Melissa tells me you're quite talented. And I went, okay. And I got a little bit like excited, but I was trying to like contain myself. And then from there, I just continued to come for the lessons. But, Melissa was gone between Germany and here. So sometimes, there'd be a week or two in between or whatnot. But I tried to maintain at least 2 lessons a week at that juncture. And then I would throw little clinics for her. And then her and Wayne had split up, and I was worried she was going to end up staying in Germany, but she would come back. And I finally convinced her she should buy a place here in this area. And so she had bought a place, a few years into it, she bought a place in Rohnert Park, and I was able to then work with her on a daily basis for about 4 years, which was a real, it was difficult, but it was a real treat. So that's where I got my apprenticeship with Melissa. I said, I'll help you and you teach me. So I got lunged, 5-6 times a day on horses. We were working with like up to 10, 12 horses a day. And then I had my own horses on top of that I was working and maintaining my own business, and at that point I had moved from the big stable that I was leasing stables, and I had built a barn on a little house property that I rented right next door to where I live right now.
And how did you make your way to Germany? Because you rode at the Neindorf Institute, and Melissa was the head rider at the Neindorf Institute.
I didn't ride there for a long time. I had the opportunity to go there for a 2-week stint, and I could have gone more, but I didn't have a lot of money. So you have to understand, at that point in my life, I'm between 25 and 30. I wasn't making a killing. I was surviving.
Tressa, hang on 1 second. I'm really sorry. Just give me one.
No worries.
Yeah. Okay, go ahead.
What were we talking about? How I got to the von Neindorf Institute.
Yeah.
I was, like I said, I had the privilege of going there for a couple of weeks. And I brought a couple students with me. So there were 3 of us, and it was on, Melissa's invitation. And I rode in 3 to 4 lessons a day there. I had saved my money so that I could do that, and that was in 2002. It was actually before I bought this place that I'm at now. It's next door to the place I was renting, and built a little riding setup for. So anyway, it was a privilege, yeah, we got lunch daily. Melissa stuck me on some more challenging horses. I rode a horse named Vatine, who was a Hanoverian. That was tricky, and she, at one point she said to me, she goes, "Who does he remind you of?" And I'm like, "Of my Arabian." She goes, "Just to let you know, every day that I had to ride this horse as I was learning to train him," she's like, "I almost threw up and I had a stomach ache." And I go, "I can see why, because even as a trained horse, he was still, yeah, I figured out she wanted me to go from the walk into the canter, and I would ask and he'd pee off. And then she'd be like, touch him with the whip, and he'd pee off bigger, And so I was like, okay, I'm doing something wrong. And Melissa, the style of teaching wasn't like, look, these are your options. You can do this, try that. There was none of that. It was like, just sit up, just do this, like, what's wrong with you? Why can't you do this kind of thing? And then I figured out that if I just relaxed my lower fingers and lifted my chin, he'd canter on. But it was like this. And the only reason why I had thought about that is because I had an experience with my Arab. He was so sensitive that just moving my head like this, it made him canter on. He was it was like a thought,
I
so
have to
this horse
interrupt
was,
you just for a second, because
yeah,
one of the reasons I wanted to get your story down so much is just precisely this, is you obviously had a lot of great opportunities presented to you, but those opportunities are nothing but an opportunity if you don't invest in them, right? If you,
right.
because you extrapolated a lot, you put in a lot of effort, you were very, very ballsy from a very young age, and you put in a lot of your own elbow grease to get the information, because as you described Melissa, it doesn't sound like she was giving you the scaffolding in your perfect learning style,
No,
you had to
no,
figure the stuff out.
no. I mean, and she had the ability to do it, but more so, she was impatient because she herself was so gifted at riding, and had to figure it out herself, that she had never, like, teaching wasn't her craft.
Yeah.
Whereas for myself, I had been teaching. I mean, that's part I skipped. Like, I started teaching when I was like 10, and before that, like, ponying kids as like a 7-year-old. I would lead kids around and have to teach them things. So I was required to teach at a pretty young age, and I liked it,
Yeah.
So I've always had an affinity for teaching. And so I have become a good teacher because I've also become a very good student. And things were not in old style trainers. It was like, well, that was dumb, or don't ever do that again, or I'll kick your butt, kind of thing. And it was never, hey, let me show you something, or here's a little detail. I had to learn those details by way of getting the tar beat out of me, essentially, by my own ventures. But so yeah, Melissa in those would just kind of be like, well, why can't you do it? Just sit up, just do this, just do that, and it would be like these big general concepts, but within each of those general concepts are little minute feelings and adjustments that are so invisible to the average eye, but they're happening nonetheless. If you're holding your breath, if your chin's too low, or you're clutching a butt cheek. I mean, a horse feels all of that, and that's something we take severely for granted. So this horse was another example of that. And I was like, oh, I figured it out. And she was like, yeah, why didn't you just do that? And so I figured out how to canter this horse on, and she had me do, a series of lead changes and blah, blah, blah. So it was a great experience. You know, we were all beaten up because we were riding several horses a day, and it's in an environment that there's certain things that are expected, how you lead the horse into the barn. The horse always has a blanket over them, you know, how you hold the reins, how you hold the whip, everything. And it wasn't particularly sugar coated or hand fed to you. So Melissa would be like, yeah, the saddle's over there in that closet over there. And then the horse is way over on that side, and go around the corner, and you know, and so you'd have to be like, okay, I'm on a you know, a egg hunt here. I can't to find a horse. I don't even know where the horse is. And then I have to go and try to find a saddle. And then I'm like, okay, but where's the pad? You know, so that part was a little stressful, but as soon as we kind of got the hang of it, we were like, oh, okay, I know where these things are. And then it was, you know, to anybody who was there, it was like not a big deal. But for us, we were coming in, you know, fresh off the boat. And it was a great experience. And what it did is it kind of resonated where I was going with the work she had been helping me with my own horses. And then later, when Melissa did come back and moved here for those few years, her and I worked with several horses that were problems. You know, all the horses we rode, they had a problem. Like a couple of them, we got a couple warm bloods for Germany that had been so burnt out in the show ring. Like one was bolting, and then the other one would just stop and start kicking out and running backwards. And there were several incidences like that where we had to fix these problems. So we started from scratch. You know, we started from the basics of correct lunging and getting the horse through the bridle on the lunge line and strong. And then she'd put me as weight on the horse's back, and I'd have to sit on them. And you know, it was honestly, like, I don't know that a lot of her students got that experience because they were riding school horses at the von Eindorf Institute, or they had their own horse that was going. But for me, that was a really invaluable experience because it gave me a window into understanding alignment and how sensitive horses are, and how our equitation and how we use our bodies so affects the outcome of helping them come through their bodies and find relaxation overall in their work, you know. And then of course there's the mental attitudes of riding and how we approach the horse, that it's never the horse's fault, it's always our fault. You know, it's always us that has to figure out the solution regardless of the problem. You know, the horse can't be their own advocate. We have to go, okay, well, you know, does the horse have an ulcer, or is it happy in its life? Is it in a routine that's consistent enough, or, you know, strong enough to do this job? You know, and I think those are things that obviously get widely taken for granted on a daily basis. So
you obviously developed, I would say, better than average by far, high problem solving skills because of your varied background, for one, but for two, you had the luck and the tenacity to work through some of those horses that because that's a skill set that I think is missing in the training world. I'm sure you would agree, is there's a difference between training and problem solving. And
absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
So to wrap it up, because we could do 3 more of these, I would love to do a million more of these. But
Yeah.
to wrap it up, what advice would you give to young people based on your experience coming into the horse industry to not just achieve their goals, but to contribute? Because I consider you somebody who is important in the horse world because you add so much value, right? Because of your experience and because of your knowledge, you add value to people that are coming up. So what is a piece of advice that you would offer these young people to become somebody that not just succeeds, but can add value back?
Well, I think you've got to find somebody that you can stick with and apprentice with so that you can learn a solid skill set. And when you find that person, you need to measure whether they're the right person or not on their ethics with horses. You know, if they're looking after the horse's well-being and trying to do things that do as little harm as possible. And I think with minimal gadgetry, you know, because if somebody's changing bits all the time or using draw reins or, you know, gadgets like that, then they don't have a very good skill set, because a trainer that has skill usually doesn't need those things, but knows how to use them correctly, number one. And as far as what they need to bring to the table is, I think, really good horsemanship in terms of horse husbandry. Knowing horses from the ground up is really important, like you've done, going and working with babies and having an idea of how all of that progresses into riding, because a lot of young people nowadays are just getting a horse, learning the one part, and they don't have any clue about how saddles fit, how a horse's foot should be trimmed, about any veterinary issues. And all of those aspects are important when dealing with horses, because it adequates to their life being holistically good. And that's important if we're going to have a partnership with them in the saddle, And so and then beyond that, that the minute force begins, your knowledge ends. This is a von Neindorf quote. And so any training that you learn really should never be based on force. It's not that we don't deal with pressures and releases and honing horses in certain directions, but the minute it gets rough, there's something going wrong. So that for me is an alarm system, and you need to then redirect who you're learning from. For me, I think that's, overall horsemanship is the epitome of that. So what do you think?
Wonderful. That's beautiful. Thank you. It's so fun to hear your story. I think we should do a part 2 so we can continue on from there.
Sure. Yeah, we can do a part 2. Yeah, because there's
so much to talk about.
Getting from the part where Melissa is and then going forward, there's so much more. And
but I think people really need to hear, because like I said, I consider you somebody valuable to the horse world, but you didn't just land in it. You had a lot of tenacity. You obviously worked very hard, and you sacrificed a lot to get what you have to give back to people. And that's, I think, a story that people need to hear.
Yeah. Well, thank you for recognizing that, because it goes unrecognized more often than not. So,
oh no, that's anyway. The first thing, the first time we talked, the thing that blew me away, and I was like, I know this person needs to be my teacher, because you understand, So thank you for sharing your story with us, and let's figure out a time for a part 2.
All right. Give me some ideas and we'll do that.
I will. Thank you for your time. Thanks so much.
All right. Bye, Amy.
Bye.